It was an ordinary autumn day. David lazily strolled through the corridors of the university library, searching for the necessary books for his thesis on occultism. He had spent several hours reading and researching, and his gaze began to blur from fatigue. Suddenly, something caught his attention in the semi-darkness between the distant bookshelves. Between two books, he found a small empty space, as if something had been there once. Shifting the volumes, David was astonished to discover a forgotten book. The brown leather cover was worn and tattered from centuries of use. There were no indications of the author or title. Carefully opening the first page, David found rough parchment covered in strange symbols. He had never seen such writing before. Flipping through the thin yellowed pages, David noticed that the text was written in several languages: Latin, ancient Greek, and a few others unfamiliar to him. It was filled with peculiar diagrams, formulas, and diagrams. It seemed like this book contained secrets not meant for mortal eyes. Unable to tear himself away, David spent the next few hours trying to decipher at least some lines in the vain hope of finding a clue about the book's origin. However, all his efforts were in vain. The language of the book seemed incomprehensible. As the library began to close, David carefully closed the book, hiding it under his clothes, and left without checking it out. He felt he had found something unique and important, even though he couldn't understand the encrypted text. For the first time in a long while, a sense of curiosity and anticipation enveloped him. Reaching his apartment, David pulled out the book and began studying it by candlelight well past midnight. However, with each passing minute, the strange symbols seemed to move on their own. Fatigue blurred his vision, and thoughts became muddled. At some point, David thought he saw the text of the book briefly change its form in the candlelight. He blinked several times, but the image vanished. Thinking it was a hallucination from exhaustion, David closed the book and extinguished the candle. Lying in bed, he struggled to fall asleep, contemplating the incredible mysteries that this book might reveal. As David began to drift into sleep, the first dreams came to him. Strange, unclear images buzzed around in the darkness. David thought he heard muffled whispers in an unfamiliar language. Suddenly, cries of horror and pain echoed. David woke up drenched in cold sweat, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. The nightmare left a strange aftertaste. David couldn't understand whose voices and images those were and where they came from. Slowly, the thought formed in his mind that it might be related to the secrets of the book. But it was just a dream, wasn't it? Waking up the next morning, David felt exhausted, as if he hadn't slept all night. The nightmare lingered before his eyes, making it difficult for him to focus. Throughout the day, David spent his time in the library, attempting to find information about the unknown scripts and languages from the book, but by evening, his efforts had yielded no success. Returning home, David had dinner and began cleaning his apartment. Suddenly, it seemed like a shadow flickered in the corner of the room. David turned sharply, but there was no one there. Nonsense, fatigue is playing a cruel joke on me, he thought, and continued cleaning. However, he soon heard a faint sound of footsteps from the adjacent room. David began to feel nervous. Entering the corridor, he found it still empty. Yet, David couldn't shake the constant feeling that he heard a barely perceptible rustling and whispers in an unfamiliar language. Deciding he was losing his mind, David locked himself in his room and attempted to read the book. But every sound startled him, and the letters began to dance before his eyes. Setting the book aside, David went to the bathroom to splash cold water on his face. Looking into the mirror, he screamed. Deep scratches were clearly visible on his neck, which he certainly didn't have during the day. Trembling with horror, David retreated to his bedroom and turned off the lights. During the night, a new nightmare haunted him. He wandered in the darkness of a labyrinth, trying to hide from ethereal voices and piercing laughter. Waking up at dawn, drenched in sweat, David realized it was not in vain. Something malevolent had infiltrated his dwelling through the book. But how to fight it, he did not know. The cursed document was tearing apart his sanity and his life. With great difficulty, David made his way to the library. A desperate plan was taking shape in his mind, to find a way to defeat the evil from the book or rid himself of it. But with each passing hour, his reality distorted further. He could no longer distinguish between dream and reality. A week had passed since David found the accursed book. He hardly slept or ate, spending all his time in the library. But with each passing day, the haunting visions became more vivid. Now, strange silhouettes seemed to flicker in the semi-darkness of the hall. Sometimes, he thought he saw someone's shadow in the library corner. He was no longer certain whether this image was true or born from a mind gradually abandoning him. At times, whispers and laughter haunted David from behind. Turning abruptly, he saw no one but still felt someone's presence nearby. The headache never left him for a moment. Returning home one night, David lit candles and tried to continue translating another fragment from the book. However, the letters began to detach from words, intertwining into unfamiliar patterns. Suddenly, he felt as if someone had leaned over his shoulder and whispered into his ear. David turned sharply. No one was in the room, but the whisper persisted. Closing his eyes and covering his ears with his hands, David tried to regain composure. However, upon opening his eyes, he horrifyingly discovered that everything around him was distorted and doubled. Getting up, David saw the walls of his apartment starting to sprout grotesque growths. He ran his hand over them, the growths trembled but didn't disappear. A scream of horror caught in his throat. David rushed out of the room and collided with an unfamiliar creature in the corridor. Lowering his gaze, he was amazed to find some bizarre predator. Reality began to warp and blur. David could no longer distinguish the space around him. Everything merged into a mad kaleidoscope of nightmarish images. He tried to run, but realized there was nowhere to go. In a semi-conscious state, David stumbled out of the building. People on the street appeared to him as grotesque monsters. He screamed and fell powerless, sinking into a world of delirium and hallucinations. Reality crumbled. Waking up, David found himself in a strange place. He lay on a dirty floor in a dimly lit space. All around were only dusty bookshelves and grimy windows. Slowly recalling the events, David realized it was the basement of the library. Someone had brought him here after he lost his sanity on the street. But madness had completely taken hold of him. David began to see things that didn't actually exist. He saw dust on the shelves come alive and contort into grotesque forms. At times, familiar faces appeared to David, but their mouths were filled with bloody teeth. They whispered to him about the secrets of the book, plunging him deeper into insanity. David had no control over his actions. He wandered through the basement, muttering unfamiliar words under his breath. Sometimes he would burst into creepy laughter without any apparent reason. Soon, David lost the ability to distinguish day from night. He saw only an endless succession of visions that further detached him from reality. Sometimes, it seemed to him that sounds and images from the past were merging with the present. He witnessed horrific creatures crawling out of the basement walls, creatures that didn't exist in reality. Madness had finally consumed David. He moved like a zombie, monotonously muttering incomprehensible phrases. His mind was completely engulfed by the demon from the book. He became its slave. Soon, David ceased to differentiate reality. He saw only nightmares that drove him further into the realm of insanity. His soul was lost forever. Professor Parker had long been concerned about David's strange behavior. One day, he found the wandering student in the library basement and was shocked by his condition. With difficulty, the professor pulled David out. He attempted to question him, but David only mumbled incoherent phrases. That's when Parker decided to visit David's apartment. There, the scientist discovered an abandoned book with strange symbols. Its pages were filled with inverted formulas and demonic symbols. With horror, Parker guessed that it was the artifact, the ancient Book of Darkness. He urgently took the book, fearing for his life. But it was already too late. the demon had possessed David. The professor faced a desperate struggle for the life of his student. For several days, Parker delved into occult scrolls, trying to find a way to exorcise the demon. Finally, he found a description of an ancient ritual. On the night of the full moon, the professor, holding the Book of Darkness, recited an incantation in the basement. David, obeying the demon, lunged at him with a scream. A struggle ensued. Light flashed from the book, and David howled with a demonic voice. Parker didn't give up, he continued reading the incantation. Suddenly, David froze for a moment, then collapsed unconscious. Parker approached and saw that his face had returned to a peaceful state. The demon was expelled. Professor Parker, tired from the desperate struggle, remained standing in the semi-darkness of the basement after expelling the demon. David lay unconscious at his feet. The faint light from the candles illuminated his calm face. Looking around, Parker noticed that the shadows had become less dense, and the air was filled with silence. In his hands, he held an open, worn-out book, which now no longer bore ominous symbols. David slowly regained consciousness. His eyes opened, but there were no traces of demonic madness in them. The professor helped him to his feet, and they cautiously made their way towards the exit of the basement. Despite his fatigue, Parker felt a sense of relief. He carried the book, but now it posed no threat. The struggle had been challenging, but it seemed they had overcome the darkness. As time passed, David recovered without any recollection of what had happened in the library basement. The professor only told him that the book had been destroyed, and the evil had receded. However, in the world that had infiltrated their consciousness during that dreadful period, only the sense of darkness and the whispers of ancient words remained. And perhaps, deep within the soul of each of them, traces of the battle against the unknown evil lingered. Despite the victory over the demon, the question of whether David was saved completely or only temporarily remained a mystery, casting a foggy glow over their uncertain future.